All right. All right, so I want to thank those of you joining us. My name is Dr. Michael Fernandez, and I have the pleasure of introducing Kristen Richardson, who is a registered dietitian, with Prime Life Nutrition. And today our topic of discussion is how diet and food can affect inflammation in your body and what effects that may have. So this is part one of a two-part series. So I'm going to turn it over to Kristen in just a moment, but just to introduce you to Kristen, Kristen is a registered dietitian who is passionate about helping her patients find their healthiest selves. She earned her bachelor's and master's degree at Westchester University, and also has her personal training certification. She works with weight loss, disease management, and sports nutrition. She's been a dietitian for 8 years, but really found her passion in the last 4 years when she decided to work in private practice nutrition counseling and open her own practice located in Royersford, PA. Most insurances are accepted and cover visits with a dietitian in her practice. So if you are interested in learning more about Kristen and her practice, you can visit her website, which is www.primelifenutrition.org. So Kristen, thank you for joining us today. I really appreciate having you. And I'm gonna turn it over to you now and let you take it from here.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity. And, we're making this work regardless of COVID or not. Because I know this is something we wanted to do in person, but, we're making it work.
Make it work.
Yeah. So I'm excited to be here, and I appreciate everybody joining in on this webinar. Like Dr. Mike said, it is a two-part series. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about, inflammation. We're going to identify it, figure out who's affected by it, and then talk about the foods that ultimately give you the issues relating to inflammation. The second part, we're going to talk more about foods that help eliminate or limit inflammation, as well as certain, strategies you can take alongside a dietitian or by yourself in order to figure out certain trigger foods. So I figured we would start with really basic, what inflammation is, exploring it and defining it. I think we all know inflammation is pretty much when something blows up to one degree or another. The exact Merriam-Webster definition is a local response to cellular injury marked by capillary dilatation, leukocytic infiltration, so on and so forth. It usually means nothing as far as trying to figure that out into words is a little bit difficult. So I just kind of said, to put it simply, when your body's white blood cells work to fight off infection, inflammation occurs. But a lot of times, like in autoimmune diseases, there is no actual invaders. Your body is just under the impression or thinks that there is an invader. And again, that's one reason that inflammation will happen. Your body acts again as if regular tissues are damaged or infected and will cause different swelling. So you can see in these pictures, swelling could be, anywhere from really egregious, like this guy that obviously got hit in the face, or it can be something like edema, fluid-filled inflammation, something like that, or as simple as like an eye that's a little bit droopier than normal, and often that can be affected by something like hydration. So we're going to dive into this a little bit more, but I just figured let's just define inflammation, talk about what it is. Inflammation can affect us literally anywhere in our body, anywhere our cells go, anywhere our blood goes. That's where we can find inflammation. So obviously in our limbs, our gut, our skin, and muscles. That can be redness. So if you have a rash or something like that, heat. If you have a limb that's hot to the touch or warm to the touch, obviously swelling is going to be an indicator of inflammation. Again, joints warm to the touch, it's painful, or you can't move it, it's stiff. Some other symptoms or signs for inflammation that don't necessarily always, it's not the first thing you think about, is fever, chills, fatigue, headaches, and decreased appetite. So that's another reason that if you have any of these sort of symptoms going on, inflammation is happening somewhere, which means there's some sort of either infection or irritation. It's a very broad response. So it's important to be able to identify why it's happening and where, and if it's related to a disease or maybe just like a strenuous workout or something like that. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. Signs and symptoms can be acute, meaning they only last hours or days, or they can be chronic. And that's, again, more along the lines of autoimmune diseases. So it can last months or even years, even when certain foods are taken out of your diet. If you identify certain trigger foods, it can take months. Again, sometimes, I'll even tell patients up to like 6 to 12 months before you really see a difference with inflammation in the gut or something like that. And as far as when it hits, inflammation can be any time of day, really. First thing in the morning, if you wake up with the stiff joints, like something arthritic related, that's an inflammation indicator. Or if you just wake up and you're not feeling, like you're feeling like sore or tired, just from not moving your body, that's another reason that you can feel inflamed. So you feel inflammation whether you are overactive, inactive. It can happen at any point, and it's usually through, like, in the morning when you first wake up. And then looking at the end of the night when you sit down and you're like, relaxing, sometimes your feet can swell or your limbs can swell because you've been going all day. And then when you finally sit down and let's say you don't elevate your feet, sometimes that can cause swelling because your feet are irritated or your legs are irritated. So again, inflammation is such a broad, it's a broad term and something that almost everyone is affected by, which is the next thing I want to get into, is who is affected. Autoimmune disease is something that I hold close to my heart because I do have an autoimmune disease that I was diagnosed with about 2 years ago. It was one that, of course, is extremely rare. No one's ever, or not no one's ever heard of, but I had never heard of. And it was something that takes, again, months to figure out how to diagnose. So when we're talking autoimmune diseases, we are talking about a huge umbrella. So I figured I would break it down into the areas of the body. So autoimmune diseases can be in the gut, which is this wonderful system right here. This is our intestine, and it's one of those things that when we feel crampy or bloated or achy, we have inflammation, but we don't always necessarily know it. We often will go days, months, years of our lives of feeling inflammation in the gut, but we just feel like it's a normal reaction. Whereas we'll get into more of like the trigger foods, but when you remove those trigger foods out of your diet, you realize that, oh, that crampiness or that bloated feeling really wasn't something that was quote unquote normal. It was something that was happening because I was eating this certain food. So GI-related autoimmune disease includes Crohn's, IBS, which is a lot of people in this world are diagnosed with IBS. It's very common. Colitis, which is an inflammation of the colon, inflammatory bowel disease, and then of course the big one is celiac. Or even just sometimes like gluten intolerance, not necessarily diagnosed celiac, but that only covers a very small amount of gut issues. It just gives you an example of what GI-related autoimmune diseases can cause inflammation. Endocrine related, so our endocrine system is basically all hormonal, and that's, our endocrine system right here. Our pancreas is right here, so that has a lot to do with things like diabetes and thyroidism. which again, thyroidism has a bunch of different specific diagnoses as well. So your thyroid can be hypo, which is underactive, hyper, which is overactive, parathyroidism, and then Graves' disease is another one. There's a lot of different signs and symptoms that distinguish each one. Metabolic disorder, again, comes right along the lines with your pancreas. Hypo or hyperglycemia is either low blood sugar or very high blood sugar, where again, your body can't regulate its blood sugar levels on its own. And then Cushing's disease is another endocrine related. Thyroid, again, is right here, and I feel like it's becoming more and more well known, which is good because a lot of people are affected by it and don't catch it or see it as soon as, you know, we would unless we were educated about it. So your thyroid is right in your neck, and again, that can cause weight loss, weight gain, hormonal imbalance, and that's one of those things too with any endocrine related disease. You're not going to see the inflammation effects or markers unless you do blood work, unless you look internally. Looking into more of the throughout the body, lymphatic related autoimmune diseases include lymphedema. So edema itself is literally like edema is when your blood cells or your cells, fill up basically with water. So everything inflames, specifically in your lymph node with lymphedema. Tonsillitis, often we are kids when we have this, but it happens. Your tonsils can swell up and it gets to the point where they have to be removed. And then other organs that are affected is your spleen, your lymph nodes, of course, your thymus, your tonsils, which we addressed, and your adenoids, which are right there with your tonsils. Joint related is another area that we see inflammation, and that's something that we normally see externally when we see any sort of inflammation. So this is just a shoulder joint. But as far as specific diseases, arthritis is a big one. Arthritis, I think we all can kind of relate to in one way or another because there are so many, again, different certain offshoots of what arthritis can be. There's rheumatoid arthritis, there's osteoarthritis, which is more bone related, psoriatic arthritis, which is skin related, and then gout, which is more joint related as well. Lupus is another one. If anybody has any experience with that, lupus, oftentimes you feel very tired, fatigued, your joints are extremely, extremely sore. So when people have what they call flare-ups, which is another, I guess, way to say inflammation, any autoimmune disease that has like a flare-up, everything is just getting angry is what I call it. Everything gets angry and it just gets inflamed. Psoriasis, eczema, and dermatitis, again, that's all skin related. So if we have any sort of rashes or things that are itchy and we can't necessarily just get rid of with an over-the-counter medication, it may be something related to psoriasis, eczema, or dermatitis. Again, that's only a couple of the skin issues that we could have that are related to an autoimmune disease. And then multiple sclerosis is another one that really does affect the joints. And again, it'll affect your walking, your quality of life overall is being able to just get around the house, driving, sleeping, all that kind of stuff. So all of these diseases, inflammation is a really, really, really big marker. You don't necessarily realize that you have any of these issues until things become inflamed, it becomes a problem, and then you have to go to the doctor and figure it out. So that's one reason that it's important to recognize, the signs and symptoms of inflammation, because it could not just be something is irritated, it could be something truly autoimmune related where you have to get medical help and do a little bit more further investigation. Other than autoimmune, everyone to some degree in their life is always affected by inflammation. So athletes is another big group of people that are going to deal with inflammation on a regular basis, whether it's working out and your muscles are inflamed and fatigued and tired. If you have an injury, obviously everything blows up if you break an ankle or something, inflammation happens because, again, the body recognizes that there is something wrong, and it inflames that area to kind of protect it. And then as well as recovery, we need to make sure, obviously, athletes are consistently recovering. So that's another important part of how inflammation affects if they're able to stay active. Medical procedures are another reason that inflammation occurs. Obviously, post-surgery, post-op, any sort of wound will cause inflammation. And then even in-office procedures. So whether you're getting a mole removed, something like that, inflammation is most likely going to occur because you're irritating the area. Physical therapy, Dr. Mike can obviously touch on that. Physical therapy, a lot of times, sometimes they'll tell you to take Tylenol or something before you come in, just to help with regulating the inflammation, because you're trying to get that joint or that muscle to move a little bit better, and you're going to have to challenge it. So physical therapy is another reason that inflammation will happen, but it's in a good what's the word I'm looking for? Not modified, but shadowed area. You're in an office with a professional. That's what matters. Infections, like we talked about, any sort of cancer, and then sometimes medications can even cause inflammation. A lot of times with autoimmune diseases, you can be put on steroids, which will cause inflammation. And over time, you'll, see that, especially if you're on a medication for a very long period of time. Steroids almost always are the answer to help relieve inflammation. But over time, they actually can cause inflammation as well. All right, so the fun part is talking about the foods that we eat and how they can cause inflammation. So it's pretty simple. It doesn't have to be, I went a little more scientific about it because I think it does help drive the point home of why we need to watch these foods. It's not that you can never have them again, but it is really modifying how much of them you have. So fried foods is a big one. They have what's called advanced glycation end products. So they are basically created when foods are cooked at a very high temperature, which oftentimes is fried. The same thing can happen if things are grilled and burnt, but most of the time it's fried because they're being cooked very, very high temps. Our body can eliminate these AGEs, but if we consistently eat fried food day after day or week after week, the buildup of AGEs will happen to the point where your body can't get rid of them fast enough, and inflammation will occur. So the more AGEs we have in our diet, the likely inflammation is going to occur. Grains and gluten are another big part of, what can cause inflammation. So when we think of like a gluten-free diet, people don't necessarily need to be in a gluten-free diet if they don't absolutely have to be. Gluten isn't a bad thing, but sometimes when it comes to, what someone has going on internally, it may give them, again, the inflammation in the gut, something like celiac. If you think about it, highly refined flours, so white breads, white pastas, the starchier carbohydrates, they oftentimes are so broken down previously in a machine when they are being made, so that when we eat them, they get basically delivered right into our bloodstream, and our body doesn't have to do the work to break any of the foods down or any of the nutrients down. So if we have a piece of whole grain bread with real seeds and nuts and good whole grains in it versus a piece of white bread, that white bread is going to be broken down in a matter of 10 or 15 minutes, and it's going to spike your blood sugar very quickly. Whereas the whole grain bread is going to take probably closer to 20-25 minutes for your body to break down, because it physically has to break down the nuts and seeds and whole grains that are within that bread. So when we have, more refined grains in our diets, it wreaks more havoc on the blood sugar and ultimately our insulin levels, which the pancreas is responsible for. So the pancreas, going back to the autoimmune issues, if you're not feeding yourself so that the pancreas is able to keep up with what you're eating, and keep up with the insulin levels, it's going to also continue to aggravate it. Some other foods, sugars, I'm sure we're very familiar with this. Added sugars are in a lot of things. There's natural sugars, there's added sugars. Some of these are natural, so honey, agave, and syrup are all considered natural. When it comes to certain jellies or candies, a lot of times they can have other effects on our blood sugar because, again, the less your body has to work to break it down, the more havoc it will wreak on your blood sugar. But what these sugars will do is produce cytokines, which actually cause inflammation and lead to reduced lean muscle mass, which is what we need. Alcohol is another form of sugar that, again, can cause inflammation, especially in the gut. And then corn syrup, we all know it. High fructose corn syrup is in a lot of foods. It's over time has gotten better as far as being eliminated, but sugars are definitely one of those things that can aggravate your body internally and ultimately give your gut issues, your joints, and make you feel not so great. Salt, we have to be careful of. If you have any sort of kidney issue, or if we have an overabundance of salt in our diet and our kidney can't get rid of it fast enough, that pressure from all the salt builds up in our veins, and that's what causes high blood pressure. So again, high blood pressure is another form of inflammation. We just have to be careful of that. And then dairy, depending on the person, lactose and casein derived from milk aren't always tolerated in the gut. And because of that, it can cause inflammation. So if you have diarrhea or constipation or something like that related to dairy, that can be one of the reasons why. All right, the last food I want to go over is trans fats. So it goes along with fried foods, but trans fats are in a lot of prepackaged foods. So anything, I always say, anything that has a really long shelf life probably has trans fats in it. So those are things like donuts, cookies, crackers, cakes like Entenmann's or Tasty Cakes or something like that. Anything fried, like I said, like, you know, chicken, French fries, whatever. All of those foods are probably going to have trans fats in them. So the reason that they cause inflammation, or the reason that they are not something that we want to have in our diet, is because of these two inflammatory markers. TNF-alpha, which stands for tumor necrosis factor, it causes an acute, so a short-term inflammation response. So trans fats have both this TNF-alpha and the interleukin 6. These two things, again, they're both cytokines, which are proteins that will cause inflammation. This was just kind of a fun fact. I thought this was interesting. There's some early evidence, because it obviously has been out very short, that interleukin 6 can be used as an inflammatory marker to figure out with COVID-19 prognosis, which I thought was interesting. So interleukin 6 is one of those, again, interleukin and then the TNF-alpha, both are part of trans fat. So the more you have of them, the more inflamed your body's going to get. It's an easier way to put it. This is just kind of breaking down the chemical structure of the foods and why they can cause inflammation. So that's just about time. I want to conclude just this first part, and then, like I said, this part 2 series is going to be foods to include in your diet, how to eliminate or identify triggers of those foods, and then also I'm going to talk a little bit about blood testing and how we can test our blood to figure out what foods are causing us issue. So to conclude, inflammation and swelling can happen to anyone at any time, and the symptoms are variable. So it's important for you to be able to recognize your own risks and signs and symptoms. Again, autoimmune disease plays a huge part in this, and it's something that when we don't stop to think about how quote unquote crappy we can feel sometimes, it can change your life if you really change your diet and make you feel better and realize that, you know, you don't have to feel terrible all the time. And a lot of times it's just the foods that we're eating and limiting those. Ultimately, you want to avoid fried foods, some grains and gluten. Everyone's different. Sugars, added sugars, and then trans fats. So not everybody has the same issues with the same foods. It's important to talk to someone like me, a registered dietitian, that can individualize your medical care and what can happen. But it is important to pay attention to it and just continue to be more aware of it. So with that, I say, any questions?
I'm not seeing any questions currently in the question and answers down below.
Okay.
Kristen, I think you and I were talking earlier before we actually started recording and going live. And from the physical therapist perspective, I think when we're looking at the person and individual as a whole, I think that it's really important to appreciate how important diet and nutrition can be in your body, in your body's ability to heal and heal from illness, prevent illness, and particularly even if you're recovering from something physical, that maybe you're coming in with a chronic back pain issue with the physical therapy. Yeah, there may be some mechanical things, but from the physical therapy world, we also know that just good quality movement, regardless of what it is, can reduce your pain.
Very important. Yeah, exactly.
Right? So there's other components beside just some physical impairment that may cause your pain. And so from the physical therapy world, we want to get people moving, but then from the nutrition world, it's important to consider what we're putting in our body, because that's the fuel that helps your body heal.
Right. And our body is always working to keep us alive and make us feel better. And sometimes we work against it without intentionally doing it.
Yeah. And it's hard because all these things that you talked about are in so many foods. I can say from my personal experience we were talking about earlier, I really struggled with chronic fatigue syndrome for several years. And, to the point where I didn't know how I was going to continue working and living my life in a very functional fashion.
Right.
And fortunately met a functional medicine physician, and the biggest thing that we changed was my diet. And really, ever since I started sticking to that strict, it's amazing. A year ago, I could barely get out of bed some days. I was so tired. Now I'm significantly better just based on taking certain things out of my diet and then feeding my body the right things.
Right.
So I think that the information you're giving is fantastic, and some of it is stuff that people might be familiar with, but I think it's important to drive home the point of, we all know that, we should eat better, but I don't think we all appreciate truly how important that is, other than I should just do it.
Right. Yeah. And it's so hard to recognize how much better you're going to feel until you do it. And the hardest part is it's going to take a lot of time. That's the hardest part. It's not going to happen in a week or even a month. It's going to take 4 to 6 months usually to really, truly feel a difference.
Yeah. And I think it's hard and it's a hard thing. Admittedly, it's kind of hard to commit to. No, from my own perspective, it was really challenging to really change my diet. But I can say that when you start to, from my personal perspective, once you start to feel and see those changes in yourself, it really makes those sacrifices and challenges worthwhile.
It does. It really does.
And once you see those changes, you don't want to go back. And it really, truly is incredible. So I'm really excited to hear what you have to say next week as far as testing, because I had some testing done myself, and as well as talking about good foods to add into your diet. So I'm really excited to hear about all of that you have to share with us next weweek.
I know, I feel like we're like just getting started, but this touches on the basic stuff, and then we'll get into the meat and potatoes more so next week as well. Yeah.
Sounds great. Kristen, if anyone has any questions in the meantime, is there a way that they could reach out to you?
Sure. They can email me at Kristen, Kristen, at primelifenutrition.org. You can also send Facebook message through, we have a Facebook, Prime Life Nutrition, or you can visit our website. Like you said, it's just primelifenutrition.org.
Okay, great. Kristen, thank you so much for the information, and I'm looking forward to hearing from you next week. We will put up the, once the time is finalized, we'll have that on our Facebook page, at facebook.com/Kinetic Physical Therapy. We will also probably by tomorrow evening, no later than the end of the weekend, have this video part 1 posted so anybody can review it and go back and look at the information that we talked about. That'll be on our YouTube channel. If you go to youtube.com and search for Kinetic TV, you can look at the channel and it will have this video on there as well as some other content if you want to follow, if you want to check that out. So Kristen, look forward to talking to you next week, and I really appreciate you sharing all this great info.
Yes, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
All right.
Look forward to next week.
Thanks. Have a great night, everyone.
All right.
Bye.